It's great to see everyone, and also some, I guess, hint of what the world could be like if there was not so much snow around here. I just wanted to welcome also the prospective students who are joining us. Some of them are joining us, or maybe all here. We very much hope we'll have a good time. Also, people should not be afraid of sitting next to me. I'm not that dangerous. We just heard an excellent ITC colloquium by Anna Wright from the Flatiron Institute, and she will tell us some more about the edge of in situ, simulating the stellar halos of dwarf galaxies. That was her original colloquium, and now she will talk about simulating the low surface brightness universe from ultra-diffuse dwarfs to Malin 1. So altogether, dwarf galaxies are an excellent test bed for testing theories of dark matter, the history of ordinary matter, and so forth. And then we'll hear from Vasily Kokorev from the University of Texas in Austin. Where is Vasily? Somewhere? Over there. So Vasily will tell us about ghosts in the Cocoon, unmasking the dense gas shell around a little red dot. That sounds like a good title for Halloween. We'll see what it means. And then Nathan De Isidio Iso is joining us all the way from Europe. Where is Nate? Somewhere. Maybe not here yet. Hopefully he will come here. The kinematic imprinting of environmental quenching in nearby galaxies. And finally, we'll hear from Sofia Uzsoy here at Harvard, who will tell us about the effect of local environment on the Lyman Alpha line profile in DESI, ODIN Lyman Alpha Emitters. It's a very rich program today. Let's start with Anna.
Yeah, that's transitioning. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. As Avi said, my name is Anna Wright. I'm a postdoc at the Center for Computational Astrophysics at the Flatiron Institute. And if you came to my colloquium, then you know that I'm really interested in faint and low surface brightness galaxies and features of galaxies. One of the basic motivations behind my research is that we have worked really hard to figure out what ingredients make things like a Milky Way-like galaxy, but we still need to figure out if those same physical prescriptions can reproduce everything else that we see. So to kind of demonstrate this idea, I've put 3 simulated galaxies up on this slide. On the upper right, we have something that is fairly similar to our own Milky Way galaxy. And then right next to it, we have something called an ultra-diffuse galaxy. So this is something that is at least 10 times less massive than the Milky Way galaxy, but which has a physical size that is not quite as large, but comparable. So this is an unusually large dwarf galaxy. And then at the bottom here is what's called a giant low surface brightness galaxy. So this is a galaxy that has a mass that's basically the same as our Milky Way analog here, but its physical size is roughly twice as large. So this is a galaxy that's more similar to something like Malin 1, for those of you familiar with that. The universe makes all 3 of these very different galaxies completely effortlessly, and so the question is how we do the same in simulations and if we can even manage that. So to address this question, I'm going to talk about some work my collaborators and I have done with the Romulus simulations. Romulus is basically 2 fully cosmological hydrodynamic simulations. We have Romulus C, which is a 10 to the 14 solar mass galaxy cluster, and my collaborators and I have looked at the origin of kind of like weird puffed up galaxies in the cluster environment, but today I am interested in how you make a weirdly big galaxy without invoking a dense environment like a cluster. So I'm just going to talk about the large galaxies that we see in Romulus 25, which is a 25 megaparsec cube volume that covers kind of a less dense region of space. Unfortunately, when we looked at Romulus 25, we found that we had not only lots of extremely average, like Milky Way type galaxies, really average dwarf galaxies, we also had tons of these large diffuse galaxies that I'm interested in. And the first thing I do when I find a galaxy that I'm interested in a simulation is I just make a movie of its evolution to see if, based on that movie, I can get an idea of what's going on. So I'm going to show you a movie of the life of one of our ultra-diffuse galaxies. So this is like the dwarf-type galaxies that are weirdly large physically. And after that, I'll show you something a little bit more quantitative. So this movie shows the evolution of one of our most massive ultra-diffuse galaxies. So this is about 10 times less massive than the Milky Way. And on the top, we have mock UVI images of this galaxy's stars. On the bottom, we have gas surface density. Each box is about 50 kpc across, and then you have a side-on view and a face-on view, although at this point in the galaxy's evolution, it really is not relevant. And so we're looking at the evolution here, and you can see that we start out with a fairly bright and fairly compact galaxy, and it stays static for a while. And then we have a 2-to-1 merger with a gas-rich galaxy that completely alters this galaxy's evolution. This galaxy grows dramatically following this merger, and its morphology becomes very disk-dominated. And if you watch the center of the galaxy, I'll let this play through again, you'll notice that after the merger, gas really moves away from the center of the galaxy. In fact, by the end of the simulation, there's just kind of a hole there. And the population of stars that's at the center of the galaxy really fades. By the end of the simulation, where we have new star formation is predominantly along the edges of the galaxy. And this contributes to making the galaxy appear larger. And we see this very clearly if we look at the evolution of effective radius, which is on the left here of this galaxy relative to the time of the merger. And if you're not used to thinking about effective radius, you can think of this as essentially just being a characteristic radius for a galaxy that reflects how compact or diffuse its light is. Now, typically, I would also show you the central surface brightness evolution, but this is a 10-minute talk, so we're not going to do that. What you can see here is that prior to the time of the merger, which is marked at time of 0 here, our galaxy is actually getting a little bit more compact. During the merger, which is this gray area here, we see the effective radius grow a little bit. And then following the merger, we see that growth continue, really up until the end of the simulation, which is about 8 billion years later. And it turns out that it isn't just this one galaxy. So what I'm showing here are the evolutions of 2 different groups of galaxies. In blue, we have galaxies that are not going to be ultra-diffuse by redshift 0. These are just your average dwarf galaxy. In red, we have galaxies that by redshift 0 will be ultra-diffuse galaxies. And I'm showing all of them. So this is very similar to the plot on the left, just a larger population. I'm showing all of the evolution of their effective radii relative to the time at which they experienced their last major merger. And prior to the time of the last major merger, these were broadly a single population. After this last major merger, however, we see that the galaxies that will not ultimately become, puffed up and large, they don't react very strongly to this last major merger that they had. There's a little bit of a brief increase in the size of the galaxy, but they basically return to normal after that. By contrast, the galaxies that become ultra-diffuse grow in response to the merger and tend to keep doing so. Now, these 2 populations actually have very similar merger histories overall, so there's nothing terribly obvious there. But the big difference between them is that the last major mergers of those that will ultimately become ultra-diffuse and fluffy is that they basically have a much more efficient conversion of orbital angular momentum during the merger into specific angular momentum. Okay, so seems like major mergers with high spin is a way to make a very large and diffuse dwarf galaxy. But how do we make a very large and diffuse galaxy that is the mass of the Milky Way? Well, at least in Romulus 25, the simulation we're using here, giant low surface brightness galaxies also form via major mergers. These mergers tend to be fairly prograde. You're going to see the first one for this galaxy here in a second. And so we see an even greater boost in the angular momenta of these galaxies in response to these mergers than we do even in the lower mass ultra-diffuse galaxies. And the result that we see here is that the disk grows, gas surface densities fall, and star formation becomes spread out and fairly inefficient. And this is true not just for the kind of 2 extremes in the spectrum that I've shown, where we have these, much lower mass ultra-diffuse galaxies, much higher mass giant low surface brightness galaxies. This is also true for kind of the vast majority of large diffuse gas-rich galaxies in the middle. This is not necessarily the only way to make a gas-rich low surface brightness galaxy, but it's certainly the dominant method that we see in these simulations. And at least to me, this is kind of unexpected. Dwarfs are one thing, they tend to be kind of their own thing. But when we think about major mergers between massive galaxies, we usually assume, and this is kind of the understanding that goes into our textbook, that they're going to cause galaxies to become more compact, to consume their gas at a higher rate, and ultimately quench, in part due to potential feeding of the AGN. And as a result of that, we expect to see destruction of a disk-like structure. And we absolutely see mergers that do that in these simulations, but they are the mergers that produce bright, compact galaxies. This kind of conventional wisdom that we have neglects the path that low surface brightness galaxies take, which is essentially the opposite. And this isn't even necessarily news. Our simulations show that this formation path is valid across a pretty wide range of masses, but analytical models have suggested this for decades. You'll see the earliest paper I'm citing here is Delcanton et al. 1997. And other simulations, including Illustris, Nihao, and Eagle, have also found that mergers can create these really fluffed up galaxies at different mass ranges. And this means that either the physics in all of these simulations is wrong, and we desperately need to revise our models, or that the way that we discuss the effect that mergers have on galaxies should change a little bit. And so with that, I'll throw up my takeaways. The first is that we have to remember the galaxies that are easiest to study, which are the bright, compact ones, are not, they're a biased subset. And we don't necessarily, that being the case, we still don't necessarily need new physics to explain faint or low surface brightness galaxies. It seems like we can make them in the same set of simulations, but it's something that we have to think carefully about when we're thinking about our intuitive understanding of physics. The other thing is that processes like galaxy mergers can have very diverse consequences for different types of galaxies. We find that they can produce both bright, compact galaxies and giant low surface brightness galaxies like Malin 1. All right.
So, Anna, from the point of view of a theorist that doesn't work with simulations, it was sort of expected to have those low surface brightness galaxies, because if you look at the probability distribution of spin parameters of galaxies, there is a tail of very low specific angular momentum galaxies, and also a tail at very high specific angular momentum, which, at the low end, it would make the little red dots that we see. And at the high end, it would make these diffuse disks that are very large. So now you can ask, okay, how does it translate into mergers? Of course, I mean, a high angular momentum environment will deposit less, will deposit all the material in a smaller, in a region that is dictated by the specific angular momentum. So why can't we think about it this way and not be surprised?
I'm not entirely sure. So I think some of this has to do with our emphasis on very high mass galaxies and the question of why galaxies quench. I've wondered about this because when I was first learning about low surface brightness galaxies, and especially like the early theories about their formation, I was very confused because reading, Delcanton et al., I was like, okay, why is it that if I look in my textbook, I'm told that this is like mergers create quenched galaxies always? I think it's completely reasonable to think of it from the perspective of distribution of angular momentum, regardless of where that angular momentum comes from. And yet, when I talk to people about this, I very frequently get the question of like, well, doesn't the AGN quench it? Why are you sure your AGN feedback just isn't, is too weak?
Okay, so but the textbook should not be revised as of yet. I mean, we do see them in the real universe, so the textbooks do, in principle, explain.
Yeah, I just think that at least the textbooks I've looked about, when I read about the effects of mergers, it tends to be very uniform. They don't talk about the fact that mergers can result in a number of things. They don't have to result in quenching. Even if it's a gas-rich merger between two very massive galaxies, you can potentially, assuming the simulations are right, which they could be wrong, but it's the fact that we see these large galaxies forming, these large disk galaxies forming from mergers is something that I don't see in textbooks.
I have a comment about the first part and the question about the second one. So we had a paper in 2021 on formation of UDGs based on observations of Common cluster, where we demonstrated, it was an interesting paper, where we demonstrated that basically the number statistics showed that the run pressure stripping was almost enough to explain the entire population of UDGs in a cluster. So you basically don't need a merger for a dwarf. You can just remove the gas by run pressure and it expands.
Yeah, and we see that in the cluster simulation
Yeah,
too.
we had a lot of discussions with Tremel and other people. Yeah. And second, it's about giant low surface brightness galaxy. That's more of a question. So we have observations now. I'm from one of the team you cited there, from Anna Saburo, who worked with her. So basically you have too much gas in those galaxies. Those are bigger than the Milky Way in terms of total mass, in baryonic mass. Okay, dark matter halo is comparable, but the gas mass is enormous, and so right now it doesn't look like it's enough supply from mergers alone. So we need to involve something else, like cooling of the gas from the hot halo,
Right.
or something like this. Do you see anything like this in there?
Right, so I haven't looked into it in these simulations, in part because the suite of simulations that I'm using here is a fairly large volume, and I don't trust the resolution of the hot medium. But I know, like the Jus paper, Illustris, has seen that, stimulated cooling from accretion of satellite galaxies. I will also say we don't quite reproduce the level of gas richness seen. Like I can't make galaxies. Yeah. Oh yeah. And I don't think we have a large enough volume to quite get anything that big. Like I did the math on like, oh, should I expect to see one of those? And in a box this small, I don't think so. But still, like that's one of the things when I was comparing to observations, I couldn't match is the level of gas richness that observed low surface brightness galaxies have. Like these are gas rich, but not that level.
Morgan?
Thank you. Is it? I'm curious if they have to be sort of prograde to a certain extent. Is it possible to just do the sort of counting experiment of like what fraction of the 4 pi possible impact parameter makes up that prograde enough? And then are there that many?
So the problem is a lot of these galaxies live in filaments. So I did do this math. I was like, okay, can you just get this by chance? And then I looked at the environments of the galaxies and I was like, oh, half of them live in filaments. And so you get preferential accretion along the filaments that tends to, yeah. And
so basically, it's not so random.
Yeah, it's
amazing.
Not. Yeah. At least in these simulations, it isn't.
Okay, thanks. Any other comments, questions? Yes, Tony?
I would think that in clusters of galaxies, that these large diffuse galaxies would have all of their gas stripped out by the intracluster medium, and that they would look very different from the same galaxies that are not in clusters, and that this, they're all going to turn into jellyfish galaxies, right?
Yeah, I mean, so we see them, they look very different in our cluster simulation than they do in our more like field simulation, and observations have also suggested this. So one of the weird things that I say I mean the very fantastic observers who have done this work and me who has read their papers have seen in some of the cluster UDGs is that some of them seem to have weird globular cluster populations, which is very different and not something that we can comment on with these simulations, but it does seem like potentially they are different beasts.
Okay, Anna again.
All right, so you guys hopefully hear me well? Yeah? Oh, good. Okay, so thank you for having me here. Good afternoon. I'm Vasily. I'm a postdoc at UT Austin, and today I'd like to talk about a little bit of my research related to LIDs. So just as a brief recap, LIDs have been in literature for the last 3 years or so, right? And to describe them, we can just say that these are extremely compact red objects that have a distinct spectral shape, namely this V-shape like SCDs with these breaks in the rest optical. And one of the reasons why we have been struggling with the interpretation initially is because of these breaks being misinterpreted by, as massive galaxies at high redshift, right? Very quickly, spectra started emerging for these things, and we saw that they contain broad permitted lines, which is a signature of an AGN. So then we started thinking that, okay, LIDs are dusty AGN, right? But then if you take these line widths at face value essentially what you derive for the black hole masses. So very, very high numbers for their redshift and also for their host galaxies, right, making the black hole to host mass ratio very high, which wouldn't be a problem if we just found a few of these things, but LIDs are quite numerous at redshift above 4 or so. So if we have a population of overmassive black holes at all of these redshifts that is so abundant, that would be a problem. Very quickly, this tension, I think, started being resolved as of recent. So we have shifted back to actually looking at the breaks and the original signature in the imaging, right? And the emerging picture is that LIDs are potentially still AGN, but they're instead surrounding by this dense cocoon of gas, right, that is causing this bomber-like break appearance in them, and effectively reprocessing the emission from whatever the central source of radiation is. So this is the things that I would like to talk about today and see if we can test this hypothesis a bit further. So just to lay it out in a bit more of a clear way, right, the three things that make up this dense gas idea, I mean, there's many more than three, but just the three main things are the breaks, right? There's bomber breaks in the dense atmospheres around the AGN, right? And they have been discussed quite a lot in the literature recently, right? They're too strong to be something that can come from a stellar population, right? And they look more like a black body sometimes if you especially combine them with the fact that the rest UV light can be coming from a host galaxy or a companion. The lines, they're broad, right? The permitted lines are broad, but the line profiles might not be simple Gaussian, right? If you have enough signal to noise in the data, you can actually fit them much better with an exponential. That is another piece of evidence that points towards the scattering in the dense gas medium. And the last thing is absorption. So we see P-signal-like profiles with blue shifted outflows, which is again a signature of something that is quite dense surrounding these objects. So most of this evidence so far has come from photometry and prism data, right, with very limited samples that actually examine these features in great detail with grating spectra. So I think to test this idea and to see if we can connect it better to actual emission line and absorption line physics in these LIDs, we need deep spectra taken with high resolution gratings on James Webb, right? So one of the ways to get deep data for free essentially is to look at lensing fields, and this is exactly the data set that I'll be focusing on today. So last year we have submitted a paper that looks at this redshift 3.5 little red dot located in the glimpse field, and the glimpse field had two deep programs, first with NIRCam about 150 hours targeting this lensing cluster field, and then followed up by about 30 hours of G395M grating with NIRSpec, right? And this is one of the targets in those fields. So it looks kind of unremarkable at the first glance, right? It's redshift 3.5, so not very high. It has all of the same signatures that we see in LIDs, right? It's red, it's compact, it has that break. So what is actually interesting about this is it's lensed, right? So our 30-ish hour spectrum or so turns into a 90-hour equivalent spectrum if this were to be seen in a blank field. So this is exactly kind of the data set that we have been looking for potentially to try and understand this dense gas idea a bit better. So how does a 90-hour spectrum of an LID look like? Well, it looks like this, right? So just to kind of anchor your eye here, the brightest line there on the left is H alpha, and the rest of it is in the near infrared, right? The average signal to noise is about 30, making it the deepest LID spectrum observed so far. And that also means that every single little bump and wiggle here, every single feature is real. This is not noise. And we can take all of these features separately and kind of like small pieces of the puzzle and combine them into this giant mosaic and see if that mosaic actually looks like a dense gas hypothesis. If we label them, what we see is a bunch of permitted lines, so H alpha, the Peixin series all the way to Peixin beta. We see very strong oxygen 1 emission, helium 1 emission. We see the P-signal-like feature in the helium. And the really, really cool thing that we also noticed is the sheer abundance of these iron 2 lines in this object as well. So individually, right, we've seen broad lines before, we've seen absorption before, we've seen iron in LIDs before, but to have all of this stuff kind of in one place allows us to really construct a set of diagnostics to test the dense gas idea. So I'll just talk about three things. There are many more things that we can talk about regarding this spectrum, but I'll mention three of them that connect to this dense gas idea. The first one is exponential profiles. So because the signal to noise is so high, we can actually test whether a simple Gaussian broadening or an exponential induced sort of scattering that induces this exponential profile are a better fit. And it turns out that all of the broad permitted lines are actually better represented by an exponential, right? That implies that this medium is scattering dominated and not just simply virial, right? So that's one piece of evidence that points to this dense gas idea. The second thing is if we now take these velocity widths and look at the intrinsic Gaussian cause instead of the broadened observed profile, the velocities go down from around 3,000 to 1,000 kilometers per second. That changes the black hole mass by about a factor of 10, so it makes it a little bit more comfortable, right, with regards to how overmassive these things are. And if exponential profiles are present, if they're ubiquitous in all of the other LIDs, that means that the tension between the tension that we had with these overmassive black holes might largely disappear if signal to noise is high enough in these data. So the second thing that I mentioned is the very prominent O1 emission and also this absorption in helium, right? So both of these things, again, within this dense gas envelope idea, right? O1 is strong because it's pumped by Lyman beta, right, through bound fluorescence. That would imply that a certain sort of density and temperature regime has to exist there, which again aligns with these ideas of dense gas causing these Balmer breaks. And the absorption in helium is something that comes from this helium-1 triplet, sort of a semi-stable state where, again, a certain regime of dense gas is, of densities in the gas is required. So both of these things, absorption and fluorescence, again, point to the same thing, right? But it doesn't mean that the gas is uniquely dense everywhere, sort of in the same uniform way. The densities that are required to produce scattered lines and helium-1 absorption or oxygen-1 fluorescence, they're slightly different, so that implies that the cocoon of gas is not just dense, it's stratified. There are different density regimes within it. The last thing that I wanted to mention is iron. So if we take our best fit spectrum to the iron lines, which is here in black, and compare it to the Lyman alpha fluorescence models, Lyman alpha pumping in iron, it's a pretty good fit, I would say, right? That, again, implies that there must be some kind of a Lyman alpha radiation field given off by potentially the central engine, the AGN, right? And the gas densities, again, have to be high enough for this pumping to even work in the first place. That points towards a dense gas yet again. So if we take all of these things and kind of try to merge them into one singular picture, this is what we see, right? So all of these diagnostics converge on a dense and stratified cocoon surrounding this broadline region or surrounding this AGN. And if we try to think about like more of a physical picture of what's going on, we can look at the line widths, right? And we can see that hydrogen and oxygen are sort of the broadest ones, so they might be closer to the broadline region. As in you start going to the outskirts, that's where you see a helium that doesn't need as high of density to make that absorption feature that we saw. And then on the sort of the edge of this envelope, you see iron 2 that is in the cooler regions around the AGN that is being pumped by Lyman alpha escaping from the center, again, as implied by the velocity widths alone. So hydrogen tells us that it's broad, helium tells us that it's dense and outflowing, oxygen and iron tell us that there is some kind of radiation field in this dense gas that is inducing these features. Is this the case for all of the other LIDs? I think only time will tell, right? But so far, just to conclude, what we have is this deep spectrum and 395M grating that, through various lines of evidence, has shown us that there is a dense gas cocoon present around this object through line shapes, absorption, and fluorescence, right? They all require this optically thick stratified cocoon of gas. Whether it's incidental just to this object, I don't think so. I think it exists in other LIDs too. So I would say so far the dense gas cocoon idea is more or less confirmed, and the real question remains is what is inside of it. Thank you.
So Vasily, regarding your last question, do you think it's a black hole or a supermassive star?
I don't know.
What's your guess?
I mean, a more comfortable answer would be a black hole. A more exciting answer would be a supermassive star. So it depends on whether I want to be comfortable or excited on a given day.
It's more exciting because we haven't yet confirmed it, but on the other hand, it would lead to a black hole anyway, so it's just a progenitor of a black hole. So in both cases, you will end up with a black hole.
I think there's limited evidence. I mean, there's not enough evidence so far to either rule out a black hole or confirm a supermassive star. I think what really is required is to look at elemental abundances, right? So supermassive star will have a certain signature. I mean, helium is one of them, right? So if you have strong helium, that's, you know, that's a good thing, but hard to say.
Yeah, so like a comment about the exponential wings. Exponential wings, they originate from single scattering mechanism. So basically you need to be optically thin. Once you're out of the optically thin regime, the core tends to flatten. So the line becomes like it has an inner component. So this might mimic a broadline region effect.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the Lauer 2006 paper that is about NGC 4395, where he actually describes the model for exponential wings, he does numerical modeling for the line profile with increasing tau. And you can see that it actually, from purely exponential, when it's like straight lines, it kind of gets like this once you increase the optical depth. Yeah, my question is actually, it's interesting that you put it on the last slide. So I wanted to ask you what the evidences are for the presence of a black hole in the middle, because there's no variability so
There
far.
is no X-rays.
No X-rays. Well, X-rays you can hide it if you have 10 to the 25, apparently, but you know. The variability, it depends on the reprocessing times, of course, but that's, to me, the main problem.
I agree. I mean, we haven't seen ionization lines, we haven't seen anything. There is no dust deterrence. I mean, but this sort of connects to the first question, right? It's impossible, I think, to really separate at the moment whether it's a supermassive star or an AGN. We thought that these are AGN just because of the broad lines, right? But then I think very quickly, at least my initial ignorance has slightly reduced, and I'm not so convinced anymore. I was more convinced in the past. Definitely, yeah.
The more data you have, the less convinced you are.
Yeah.
Devesh, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, great talk. I was just wondering, what do you think is the source of these iron lines? Like, what mechanism is actually producing this iron? Where do we get all this iron in such a small volume?
So, they must have been made somehow. Right? So something hasn't reached the gas there. If we look at the SCDs of LIDs, right? I mean, like, just scroll back to here. So there is a blue component, right? So there could be a host galaxy. There's been works recently that claim that the blue component can be somewhat extended. That again is more host galaxy-like. So the galaxy itself can potentially inject iron into that. Also, I mean, even if iron is produced in very small quantities, right, just because of how compact this dense cocoon would be, right, I don't think a lot of iron would be required in the first place to make these iron lines. But it's very confusing to me, especially like when you try to think about, well, LIDs are direct collapse black holes, or they have supermassive star-like signatures. That requires kind of a pristine gas in there, right? So the iron, I mean, more or less pristine gas, right? So I'm not sure where the iron can be coming from.
Sorry, just one quick one. What do you think is the total mass of these cocoons, roughly speaking? So do we have an idea of this dense cocoon? Is it like a solar mass, 10 solar mass, 100 solar masses? Do we have?
I mean, at least what we get for the black holes, if we assume it's in black holes, 10 to the 6, 10 to the 5, right? Supermassive stars, I think they would have a similar range of masses, about 10 to the 4.
It's the shell, I mean, it's just the shell, just the cocoon mass. I'm wondering. I don't know the answer.
It depends on your master light. You can assume that given the luminosities and temperatures that we get just purely from the black body point of view, you can try to estimate the sizes of these cocoons, and then if you assume a typical density, then that can give you an answer. But it's, yeah, all depends highly on your master light.
Okay, well, Vasily will be around today.
Yeah, I'll just be in the lobby, so please.
There seems to be a community of people here working on LRDs, and they might have more questions for you. So let's thank Vasily again. like we're missing the speaker. Maybe he didn't find the place. So we'll move on to the fourth speaker, Anna. And we will be able to ask you more questions because we have more time.
You switch it on top? No, on the little box.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Great. Okay. Maybe I'll move it up. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Sofia. I'm a PhD student here at Harvard. I'm in my 4th year, and I work primarily with Doug Finkbeiner. And I'm excited to talk to you about my work on the effect of the local environment on the Lyman alpha line profile in Lyman alpha emitter spectra. Okay. So why are Lyman alpha emitters important? So Lyman alpha is an emission line of neutral hydrogen. Lyman alpha emitters, or LAEs, are galaxies with strong Lyman alpha emission. They are typically young, metal-poor, star-forming galaxies, and they're important because they're tracers of large-scale structure at high redshift. Here, high redshift means like redshifts 2 to 4. They allow us to probe things like the circumgalactic and intergalactic medium, the onset of the epoch of reionization, and because they have one very strong emission line and very little continuum emission, they're helpful for redshift determination. So just a bit of motivation here. We're members of the DESI collaboration. DESI is the Dark Energy Spectroscopic Instrument. It is an optical fiber spectrograph located in Kitt Peak in Arizona, and it collects millions of high-quality galaxy spectra. Its focal plane allows it to measure spectra of 5,000 galaxies at once, which is pretty crazy. DESI 2 is the next iteration of DESI that's planned, I believe, to start in 2027, so next year. And it aims to focus specifically on higher redshift targets. And it aims to observe around 1.5 million Lyman alpha emitters. So we want to optimize LAE selection and analysis for future surveys like DESI 2, but we need to understand any potential systematics in the Lyman alpha line in order to properly use LAEs as cosmological probes. So LAEs are usually selected with narrowband photometry. So ODIN is a survey. It stands for 100 degrees in narrowband, and it uses custom narrowband filters to select LAEs. So specifically, we're using these two filters, N419, which selects LAEs around redshift 2.45, and N501, which is around redshift 3.1. So LAEs are selected using the narrowband excess, so the difference between the narrowband magnitude and the G-band. All these broadbands are from DECAM, the dark energy camera. And so once we have a set of LAEs that have been selected photometrically, we can follow them up with DESI to collect spectra. So we have DESI spectra of thousands of ODIN LAEs. So this is a matrix where every column is a spectrum, and then these signals are the Lyman alpha line. And so there are two regions. One is around redshift 2.45, the first narrowband, and one is around redshift 3.1, the second narrowband. And so the spectra are ordered by redshift, so that's why you see the Lyman alpha wavelength increasing as we go from left to right. So as a side note, we needed to measure the redshifts of all of these spectra, and there are thousands, which makes it not really tenable to do that manually. So before this, we developed a statistical method to automatically determine redshifts for LAEs and DESI spectra. We use a Bayesian component separation technique that we developed to separate a galaxy spectra into the Lyman alpha line, into sky emission lines, and anything else. And we validate it with injection recovery tests on simulated spectra like you see here. And we do a lot of uncertainty quantification. So if you're interested in that, you can scan this code or you can ask me about it afterwards. But we needed to do that so that now we can use these spectra for downstream science tasks. So folks from the ODIN collaboration, this is work from Vandana Ramakrishnan from Purdue, created LAE surface density and protocluster maps. So because we're working with narrowband regions, we can essentially treat them as like two-dimensional because it's a very, very narrow redshift range. And so these are parameterized in terms of the surface overdensity parameter, this delta LAE, which is quantified by calculating the surface density at every point and dividing it by the average surface density of the whole field. So here we have these surface density maps in the Cosmos and the XMM fields. The top row is at redshift 2.45 in the first narrowband, and the bottom is at redshift 3.1. Here the darker regions correspond to higher surface densities, and then the yellow regions indicate protocluster regions. So once we have these surface density maps and we have the DESI spectra, we want to explore the relationship between the environmental density and the shape of the Lyman alpha line profile. So this is the surface density maps, and these are all the places where we have DESI spectra. So then we can take these DESI spectra and stack them in bins of delta LAE to explore that relationship. And what we find is that the Lyman alpha line profile does depend on environmental density. So these are stacks of galaxy spectra in bins of delta LAE. On the left are linear bins of delta LAE, and on the right are percentile bins. But in both cases, the darker colors correspond to galaxies at lower values of delta LAE or less dense regions, and the lighter colors are higher delta LAE or more dense regions. So in both cases, we can see that a denser environment indicates more Lyman alpha line flux. On the left, in the linear bins, we can see this very clearly, but we also see that the stacks become more and more noisy as we get to higher and higher delta LAE values, because galaxies in these extremely overdense regions are more rare. So to mitigate this, we do the same stacks but in percentile bins. So that's why the color bar looks so weird, is because we're changing the intervals to make sure that there are the same number of galaxies in every stack. So here there are 192 galaxies in every stack. Something else that we can see from this percentile bin plot is that the Lyman alpha line flux changes, but the actual shape of the line profile doesn't really change. There's no evolution in the presence or absence of a blue peak or an increased or decreased asymmetry. And that's promising because if we want to use Lyman alpha emitters as cosmological probes, we want to know what changes the line profile and what doesn't. We can also do this analysis, but for the protocluster regions. So here, the blue stacks are galaxies that are in protoclusters, and the orange stacks are galaxies outside of protoclusters. On the left are at redshift 3.1, and on the right are at 2.45. So we can see that LAEs in protoclusters have larger Lyman alpha line flux at redshift 3.1, but not at 2.45. And this suggests a potential redshift evolution in this effect. We would expect something like this because we know that the star formation rate and density relationship reverses, but this is a bit earlier than we would expect, so that's potentially interesting. One of the things that we were concerned about when we first found this effect is that it's actually a selection effect and it's not a real physical effect. And so to test this, we do a kind of matching analysis where we take every in-protocluster galaxy and match it to its most similar out-of-protocluster galaxy according to different physical characteristics to try and control for these. So on the left are stacks made by matching every in-protocluster galaxy to the outer-protocluster galaxy with the closest R-band magnitude. By doing that, we're trying to probe the star formation rate and the UV continuum. And on the right, we're doing the same thing, but matching by redshift. Even though it's a really, really narrow redshift range, we wanted to make sure that there's no trend with redshift. But in both cases, we see that the effect is still there. The galaxies in protoclusters have a more significant Lyman alpha line flux than the ones outside of protoclusters. Another thing that we can do with these percentile bin stacks, since they have the same number of galaxies, we would hope that they have similar noise properties. We can take them, we first measure the redshift based on the Lyman alpha line, but we know from the literature that there's an expected offset from the systemic redshift of around 200 kilometers per second. So we can take all of these stacks and measure the redshift again, but from the helium-2 and oxygen-3 lines, and calculate this velocity offset, but for each stack. So this is as a function of the environmental overdensity. This is the first time I believe anyone's done this. We find a slight trend where galaxies in overdense regions have slightly more significant offsets, but it's pretty weak, so I wouldn't draw any significant conclusions from it. We can also use this rich data set to do data-driven selection of double-peaked LAEs. So we usually think of Lyman alpha as being a single peak, but there are a lot of reasons why it could potentially be double-peaked, such as AGN outflows or interacting systems, or just the geometry of the gas in the galaxy. So we can take all of our LAE spectra and align them all at rest frame, and then create a data-driven covariance matrix and find the eigenvectors. These are basically our principal components. And then for any given object, we can express its Lyman alpha line profile as a set of coefficients on these eigenvectors. And so we can use those to quantify the shape. And then we can make cuts on the values of these coefficients to identify ones that are double-peaked. So when we do this, on the right, you can see stacks of the ones that we identify as double-peaked versus not. And so you see the really significant blue peak there. And since we're able to actually identify the double-peaked galaxies, we can redo our analysis of inside or outside of protocluster stacks, but just for the double peaks. And what we see is that we don't see excess Lyman alpha flux in the double-peaked protocluster LAEs. And so this suggests that the mechanisms that are making galaxies have double-peaked emission lines might also be interacting with the environmental density. So that's also potentially interesting. So that was all I had prepared. I'd like to thank the DESI collaboration, and I'll leave my conclusions up, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Galaxies are fed with neutral hydrogen through the filaments. I mean, these are cold flows that people predict based on simulations. And they should also emit Lyman alpha, and I was wondering if you can say anything about the emissions from outside the inner cores of the galaxy. Could it contribute, like in the proper cluster environment, you might have those filaments emitting some of the flux? Do you have any sense of that?
That is a good question. This isn't something I've thought about a lot, but I do know that the DESI fibers are actually quite small. I would be surprised if that would be an effect that we wouldn't be thinking about, but that's something I can look into.
They in arc seconds?
I believe they are 0.1 arc seconds.
No,
1.5 arc seconds, yeah.
Oh, okay, so that's pretty small. Yeah. Okay, thank you. We have time for a lot of questions. You did such a great job explaining things, so now people have no questions. Yes, please.
Observational question.
Yeah.
Do you have any troubles with interlopers at low redshifts? Like, I don't know, confusing Lyman alpha with MG2, or what, MG2 is resolved, but okay, with something else?
Yeah, we definitely do. We have problems with identifying things like the oxygen doublet and things, and confusing them with Lyman alpha. Also with residual skylines, that's also a problem. This is something that the DESI pipeline has put a lot of effort into, but this is also something that when we were developing our Redshift pipeline, we tried to do. That's one of the reasons why we use component separation to identify all of the known skylines and separate that out of the spectrum so that we can more clearly identify which one is actually Lyman alpha.
Please.
So I have a question about the future. So
Okay.
in DESI2, how
Yep.
many sources do you expect, and what redshift you would target? So you're going to higher redshift with DESI2, or is it the same?
Yeah, so my understanding, Daniel, you can definitely jump in if you have thoughts, but my understanding is it's going to be order millions of LAE spectra, and we're usually trying to find between redshifts 2 and 4. So, yeah.
So it's similar.
Yes, that's the idea.
You
Yeah.
can go to scales bigger than clusters if you have a million.
Potentially.
Okay.
Great. Yes, please.
As someone who's not used to thinking about C meaning redshift rather than velocity,
Oh.
can you give a sense for why, or do you have any theories behind why, like, the difference of, the in and out protocluster has a redshift dependence at 2.45 versus 3.1? Like, what's the time scale difference in the galaxy evolution process, and like kind of doing it in a previous merger history? Is there any, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, totally. This is something that we thought about a lot, and we're still not totally sure about. I mentioned the star formation rate density relationship, but that doesn't quite explain it. One caveat here is that we are treating these data sets of LAEs as two-dimensional, even though they're not. They're very narrow redshift ranges, but we're basically marginalizing over that redshift axis. There's some new work that's coming out of the people that I cited from the ODIN collaboration. They're doing probabilistic modeling of the protocluster regions to try and model them in 3D and seeing if that changes the effect. I think that paper is supposed to come out soon, but I think potentially that's a factor in it too, is that right now we're just using the two-dimensional ones. I would expect that the ones using three-dimensional maps would maybe show a bigger difference. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I have a slight concern that the delta Lyman alpha emitter, the overdensity measure, is perhaps not really representative of galaxy overdensity, because Lyman alpha is just one way to select galaxy. Do you have any concern on that, and any way to address this issue?
Sorry, can you say that again? Do you mean that yeah?
Lyman alpha emitter selection is just one way of selecting galaxy, and it's not really representative for many galaxies, for example, Peixin,
Sure.
DESI galaxy, for example. And do you have any concern on this statistic versus the overdensity of Lyman alpha emitter is not representative to galaxy overdensity?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we're necessarily trying to make conclusions about galaxy overdensities over all kinds of galaxies. This was specific to LAEs. I do think that, I don't know, if you want to study other kinds of galaxies, you would have to think about if that's the correct metric to use.
There are some constraints on the bias parameter of LAEs
Yeah.
relative to the rest of the population, so you can find that in the literature. I mean, they do represent the matter density profile, but with some bias parameter. Okay, if there are
Thank
no
you.
more questions, let's thank all the speakers.